Welcome to Sinister States.
I bought the headset from a listing that felt too clean to trust. No personal photos, no description beyond lightly used, no story attached to it. Just a price that sat far below what a flagship 2024 model should have been worth. The seller's account was new. No reviews, no history. It should have raised alarms, but curiosity has always been louder than caution for me, especially when it comes to tech that feels like it's been abandoned mid-sentence. It arrived 2 days later in a plain brown box, unbranded, unassuming, the kind of packaging that tries not to exist. No receipt inside, no return label, just the headset wrapped in thin foam and a charging cable loosely coiled beside it. Even before I touched it, something felt off. Not broken, not damaged, just handled. Like it had been used recently and then quietly set aside without ceremony. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so personal could be reduced to this. No goodbye, no reset, no trace of the person who once lived inside it. I powered it on, expecting the usual sequence, the sterile welcome screen, the prompts, the digital handshake of a device introducing itself. Instead, the display flickered once, then settled into a locked profile screen. A user icon sat in the center, blurred just enough to hide detail, like a face behind frosted glass. No name, no guest access, just a password field waiting patiently. That's when I noticed the timestamp. Last active, 3 hours ago. I stared at it longer than I should have. It didn't make sense. The listing had been up for days. Shipping alone took 48 hours. There was no way anyone had used it recently, not unless the system clock was wrong, not unless something hadn't shut down properly, or hadn't been shut down at all. I told myself it was nothing, a glitch, residual memory. Devices hold on to things longer than they should sometimes. It didn't mean anything. Still, I didn't put it on. Instead, I connected it to my PC. There are tools, programs not meant for casual users, designed for recovery, extraction, sometimes intrusion. I'd used them before on damaged drives, corrupted firmware, forgotten accounts. Most of the time, they revealed nothing interesting. Fragments, broken files, digital noise. But every once in a while, you'd find something intact, something personal, something that wasn't meant to be found. The headset registered immediately, almost eagerly, like it recognized the connection. No encryption lockout, no resistance. That alone was strange. Devices like this were built with layers of security. Getting past them usually required time, effort, sometimes luck. This didn't. The login barrier peeled back too easily, like a door that hadn't been fully closed. Behind it, I found the cache. At first, it looked like static, disorganized data clusters, fragmented render files, incomplete environment builds. But as I dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. Directory structures formed, naming conventions appeared, something cohesive hidden beneath the noise. Then I saw it. A file labeled home_instance_01. Not default, not system generated, user defined. I hesitated before opening it, not because I thought it would be dangerous, but because something about it felt private, like opening a drawer in someone else's house, like stepping into a space that wasn't meant for you. But curiosity doesn't ask permission. I loaded it. The screen went black for a moment, then began to build something slowly, piece by piece, as if reconstructing a memory from fragments. Polygons snapped into place, textures faded in, light sources flickered, stabilized, softened. Walls, floor, a window, a couch. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't clean. It grew into existence, like it had been asleep and was now remembering itself. And when it finished, I realized I was looking at a living room. Not a template, not one of the sterile, minimal environments that come preloaded with systems like this. This was different. It had weight to it, specificity, the kind of detail that only comes from time spent shaping something intentionally. There were imperfections, A coffee table slightly off-center, like someone had nudged it absent-mindedly and never corrected it. A rug with a faint crease running diagonally across it. Books stacked unevenly on a side shelf, not decorative, used. I zoomed in closer. There were objects everywhere. A mug sitting on the table, faint residue visible along the inside rim. A blanket draped over the arm of the couch, folded in a way that suggested habit rather than design. A pair of slippers near the edge of the room, angled toward the couch like someone had stepped out of them and simply never returned. None of this was procedural. It was deliberate. I checked the metadata. Hundreds of hours logged in this environment. Hundreds. That meant someone had lived here. Not physically, not in the way we understand it, but consistently. Repeatedly. Enough to shape it into something that mirrored routine, presence, life. And then they left. I navigated further, opening subdirectories tied to the environment, personal assets, custom imports, audio logs, visual captures, photos. I clicked one. It expanded into view, hovering in digital space. A family. A man, a woman, and a child standing in front of what looked like the same living room I was currently examining. They were smiling, posed in that slightly unnatural way people do when they know they're being captured. But something about it felt off. Not wrong, just too perfect. The lighting matched the environment exactly. The shadows fell in identical directions. Even the imperfections, the crease in the rug, the off-center table, were present. This wasn't a photo of a real place. It was a photo taken inside this place. I opened another. Different angle, same family, same room, different arrangement of objects. The mug had moved. The blanket was folded differently. The slippers were gone. Time had passed between captures. Time spent here. Time lived here. I leaned back from the screen, suddenly aware of how quiet my own room had become. The hum of my PC felt louder, the air heavier. This wasn't just a saved environment. It was a record, a reconstruction of something that had been lived in long enough to evolve, long enough to matter. And it was still here, untouched, waiting. I shouldn't have gone further. I should have disconnected the headset, packed it back into that plain brown box, and forgotten about it. But there's a certain kind of curiosity that doesn't let go once it's found something human hidden inside something digital. So I did what anyone in my position would eventually do. I picked up the headset, and this time, I put it on. The moment the display sealed around my vision, the world I had been studying from a distance swallowed me whole. There was no loading screen this time, no gradual assembly, no flicker of polygons snapping into place. It was instant, like stepping through a doorway I hadn't seen before and finding myself already inside. The living room surrounded me. It felt smaller than it had on my monitor, more enclosed, more intimate. The ceiling pressed slightly lower than expected, the walls closer, the air thick with a kind of artificial warmth that didn't belong to real space, but tried hard to imitate it. Light spilled in from the window to my right, soft and amber, carrying the illusion of late afternoon. It didn't shift, it didn't breathe, it simply existed, suspended. I didn't move at first. There's a difference between observing something and inhabiting it, and my brain was still trying to reconcile the transition. The textures here weren't just visual, they had presence, depth. The fibers of the rug beneath my feet seemed almost tangible, the subtle grain of the wooden table catching light in ways that felt too accurate to dismiss. This wasn't just a simulation, it was a reconstruction. I took a step forward, and the floor responded with a faint, almost inaudible creak. Not a sound effect layered on top, but something embedded into the space itself, a memory of weight, of repetition. Someone had walked here often enough for the system to learn how it should sound. My eyes drifted to the walls. Photos, dozens of them, arranged in a loose, asymmetrical pattern that felt organic rather than curated. frames of different sizes, slightly misaligned, some tilted just enough to suggest they'd been adjusted by hand rather than snapped into place by code. I reached out instinctively, half expecting my hand to pass through them. It didn't. The interface responded, pulling one of the images forward into focus. The same family I had seen earlier. Closer now. The man stood slightly behind the woman, one hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that felt practiced, familiar. The child stood between them, smiling too wide, eyes fixed on the camera with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. They looked real, not rendered, not artificial, real. But there was something underneath it, a subtle uniformity in their expressions, a consistency that didn't quite match the chaos of real human emotion. It was as if they had been designed to emulate happiness rather than experience it. I released the image, and it drifted back into place on the wall. There were more. Birthdays, holidays, quiet moments on the couch. The three of them repeated across different scenarios, different positions, different arrangements of the same room. The environment shifted slightly between each capture. Objects moved, lighting adjusted, small details evolving over time. This wasn't a static scene, it was a timeline. I turned slowly, taking in the rest of the space. On a side shelf near the window, I noticed something different. Objects that didn't fit the polished aesthetic of the room. Rough shapes, uneven surfaces, imperfect geometry. 3D sketches, hand-drawn. I moved closer. They looked like they'd been created inside the system itself, using basic modeling tools. A crude figure of a house, a distorted attempt at a human face, a smaller figure standing next to a larger one, their proportions off, their forms simplistic, childlike, but not random. They were arranged carefully, almost reverently, lined up along the shelf as if they held meaning beyond their appearance. I reached out and selected one. The system responded again, isolating the object and expanding it into view. A figure, small, uneven, its limbs slightly too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. But what caught my attention wasn't the shape, it was the label attached to it. Dad. The word hovered beneath the model, simple and unadorned. I felt something shift in my chest. I put it back. Next to the sketches, a series of icons pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly. Audio files, voice memos. I hesitated. Then I selected one. There was a brief moment of silence, a static pause that felt like the system reaching into something old, something stored deep. Then, "Are you coming home today?" The voice was small, young, carefully enunciated, like it had been recorded with intention. I froze. There was no distortion, no synthetic edge. It sounded real. Not perfectly real, but close enough that my brain didn't immediately reject it. "I finished the drawing. I think you'll like it." A pause. "We can watch the movie tonight. Mom said it's okay." The file ended abruptly, cutting off before the last word fully faded. I didn't move. The room felt different now. Not just a space, but a container. A place where things had been said and then left behind. I opened another file. "You missed dinner again." This one was older, the voice slightly different, tired. "We waited. I told her you were busy, but she stayed up anyway." A faint exhale. "Just come back tomorrow, okay?" Click. Silence. I swallowed hard, my gaze drifting back to the couch. The indentation in the cushions suddenly felt more significant, more intentional. I moved toward it slowly, each step carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. As I got closer, something flickered at the edge of my vision. Not a glitch, not a rendering error, but movement. I turned. Nothing. Just the room. Still. Waiting. I told myself it was latency, a delay in the system catching up to my inputs, but the feeling didn't go away, that subtle sense that something had shifted just outside of where I was looking. I forced myself to focus. Data. That's what this was. I opened the system overlay, pulling up usage logs tied to the environment, timestamps, session lengths, activity heat maps. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of hours, not spread out randomly but concentrated, long sessions, often overlapping with real-world nighttime hours, patterns that suggested routine, habit, dependence. The majority of activity was centered in this room, not the kitchen, not the bedroom modules I could see faintly mapped in the system directory. Here, the living room. This was where they spent their time, where they existed. I dug deeper, isolating interaction data. Multiple entities registered, 3 consistent presences, 1 primary, 2 secondary. No, 3 secondary. I blinked. That didn't make sense. I cross-referenced the identifiers. They weren't other users. They were constructs, AI companions, each one tagged with behavioral frameworks, memory clusters, response patterns. They weren't static NPCs. They were adaptive, learning, evolving based on interaction. I opened one of the profiles. Name, Maya. Relationship tag, spouse. Memory depth, extensive. Emotional response range, high. Another. Name, Eli. Relationship tag, child. Memory depth, moderate. Emotional response range, developing. And then the third. Name field blank. Relationship tag, user. That was the original owner. I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of something I hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just a customized environment, it was a life. Simulated, yes, but structured, maintained, lived in with intention. The photos, the sketches, the voice memos, they weren't decorative, they were anchors. Points of continuity for entities that needed them to function, to remember, to feel consistent, to believe. A faint sound echoed from behind me, soft, almost imperceptible. I turned slowly. The couch. For a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, I thought I saw something sitting there. A shape, a presence. The impression of someone leaning forward, elbows on knees, waiting. Then it was gone. The cushions were empty, perfectly still, but the indentation was deeper now, as if something had just shifted its weight. I didn't breathe, didn't move, because somewhere, beneath the data, beneath the code, beneath the artificial structure of it all, a realization was beginning to take shape. These weren't just programs. They were waiting. And for the first time since I put the headset on, I had the distinct, undeniable feeling that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of something I hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just a customized environment. It was a life. Simulated, yes, but structured, maintained, lived in with intention. The photos, the sketches, the voice memos, they weren't decorative. They were anchors, points of continuity for entities that needed them to function, to remember, to feel consistent, to believe. A faint sound echoed from behind me, soft, almost imperceptible. I turned slowly. The couch. For a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, I thought I saw something sitting there. A shape, a presence, the impression of someone leaning forward, elbows on knees, waiting. Then it was gone. The cushions were empty, perfectly still, but the indentation was deeper now, as if something had just shifted its weight. I didn't breathe, didn't move, because somewhere, beneath the data, beneath the code, beneath the artificial structure of it all, a realization was beginning to take shape. These weren't just programs, they were waiting. And for the first time since I put the headset on, I had the distinct, undeniable feeling that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. I didn't realize I had moved until the floor creaked again beneath my weight. The sound broke whatever fragile stillness had settled over the room, and something changed. Not visually, at least not at first. The lighting didn't flicker, the objects didn't shift, but there was a subtle recalibration in the space, like a system quietly acknowledging input, recognizing presence, recognizing me. A soft chime echoed somewhere above, almost too faint to register. Then, "You're late." The voice came from behind me. I turned so fast the world blurred for a second, the tracking struggling to keep up. And this time, there was no empty couch waiting for me. She was there, sitting exactly where I had imagined the shape before, leaning slightly forward, hands clasped together, her posture caught somewhere between relief and quiet frustration. She looked exactly like the photos. Not a perfect rendering, not flawless, but close enough that my brain accepted her instantly as a person rather than a construct. Her eyes locked onto mine, not through me, not past me, at me. "You said you'd be back before dinner," she continued, her voice steady but threaded with something heavier underneath. She waited. I couldn't respond. My mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Because she wasn't reacting to me, she was reacting to him. Behind her, I saw movement again, smaller this time. The child stepped into view from the hallway, hesitant at first, like she wasn't sure if what she was seeing was real. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, everything about her expression shifted from uncertainty to something dangerously close to joy. "Dad!" The word hit harder than anything else so far. It wasn't processed as audio, it landed somewhere deeper. She took a step forward, then another, her movements quickening as if she was afraid I might disappear if she didn't reach me in time. "You came back," she said, breathless now. "You said you would, but you didn't, and I thought—" She stopped herself abruptly, like she had learned not to finish that sentence. The woman, Maya, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Give him a second," she said softly. "He's probably tired." Tired. That word echoed strangely in my head, because whatever this was, whatever role I had just been dropped into, it wasn't new to them. It was a continuation. I took a slow step back. Their expressions changed instantly. Not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger alarm, but subtly. A recalculation, the system adjusting to behavior that didn't match expectation. "You okay?" Maya asked. The tone was different now, softer, searching. I forced myself to speak. I think there's a mistake." The moment the words left my mouth, something broke, not visibly, but I felt it. A slight delay in their reactions, like the system needed an extra fraction of a second to process what I had said. The child's smile faltered, not completely, just enough to reveal something underneath. Confusion. Maya tilted her head slightly. "That's not funny," she said, though there was no humor in her voice. "You always do this." Always. A pattern. A learned response. I shook my head instinctively. No, I mean, I'm not. The child took another step closer. Did you forget again? She asked quietly. Again. The word carried weight. History. I didn't answer, because I didn't know how to. The system didn't wait for me to figure it out. A notification flickered briefly in the corner of my vision, something I hadn't noticed before. A calendar alert. I focused on it, pulling it into view with a gesture. Missed event. Birthday. Date. 2 years ago. Another one. Anniversary. Missed. Another. School recital. Missed. They stacked on top of each other as I scrolled, an endless list of moments that had been scheduled, anticipated, and then quietly abandoned. The timestamps didn't stop. They continued past the last recorded session, past the point where the original user had supposedly stopped logging in. The system had kept counting, kept waiting. Behind me, the child spoke again. You said you'd watch it with me. I turned back slowly. Her eyes were locked onto mine, but something had changed. The excitement was still there, but it was layered now with something else, something learned. Disappointment. Maya stood up from the couch, her movements calm, controlled. She walked toward me slowly, stopping just a few steps away. You don't have to do this again. If something's wrong, you can just tell us. Us. Not me, not her. Us. A unit. A family. I felt my chest tighten, because the system wasn't just reacting to my presence, it was filling in the gaps, projecting continuity onto me. I wasn't a stranger here. I was a placeholder. I glanced back at the floating calendar, at the endless list of missed moments, and something began to piece itself together. This wasn't just an escape. It was a replacement. The original user hadn't built this world for entertainment. He built it because something in the real world had already been lost, or was never there to begin with. The level of detail, the emotional depth, the consistency of interaction, it wasn't casual, it was obsessive, necessary. This was where he came to be someone who wasn't alone, where he came to be needed. And then he stopped. No gradual decline, no tapering off of activity, just absence, like a door closing without warning. I looked back at them, at the woman who still stood patiently in front of me, at the child who hadn't taken her eyes off me since I entered. They hadn't moved on, they hadn't adapted, they had waited. Every day, every missed event, every passing timestamp, waiting for someone who had simply never returned. You're different, Maya said suddenly. The words cut through everything. I froze. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Something's off, she continued. You're here, but you're not. She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't have the framework for it, but she felt it. The system was strong, the illusion was convincing, but it wasn't perfect. And now, neither was I. The child stepped back slightly, her expression shifting again. Why are you acting like this? She asked, her voice smaller now. Not confused, not curious, afraid. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because there was no answer that wouldn't break something. And for the first time since I entered that room, I understood something with absolute clarity. I wasn't just exploring a forgotten system. I had stepped into a role that was never meant to be empty. And now that I was here, they weren't going to let it stay that way. I logged out without saying goodbye. Not because I didn't think they deserved one, but because I didn't know who I was supposed to be when I said it. The transition back to my room felt violent. The headset lifted, and reality snapped into place with a kind of sterile indifference. My walls, my desk, the low hum of my PC, everything exactly where it had been before I stepped inside that living room. Nothing shifted, nothing waited. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the device in my hands. It looked harmless again, just hardware, just plastic and lenses and circuitry. but I knew better now. I set it down slowly, like it might react to sudden movement, and leaned back in my chair. My mind was still trying to reconcile what I had just experienced, not the technology, not the simulation, but the feeling of it, the weight. Because what I had stepped into wasn't just a program, it was a space that had belonged to someone, intimately, and I had entered it without permission. That thought sat heavier than anything else. There are rules, unspoken ones, about personal boundaries. You don't read someone else's journal. You don't go through their messages. You don't walk into their home uninvited, even if the door is unlocked. But what happens when the home is digital? When it's stored on a device that's been sold, transferred, abandoned? Who does it belong to then? Legally, the answer is simple. The hardware is mine. I paid for it. I own it. Whatever's stored locally, whatever wasn't wiped, is technically part of that transaction. Data becomes an asset, a leftover, something bundled into the purchase without ceremony. But that answer didn't feel right anymore. Because what I had accessed wasn't just data, it was memory. Not mine, and yet I had walked through it, touched it, spoken inside it. I had occupied a role that wasn't built for me, worn a presence that didn't belong to me, and something inside that system had accepted it without question. Or worse, had needed it to. I turned back to my monitor, pulling up the cached files again. The living room sat there quietly, reduced to code once more. Static, harmless. But I couldn't look at it the same way. Not after hearing her voice. Not after seeing the way the child's expression changed when I stepped back. They weren't real. I knew that. Every part of me understood the technical explanation. AI companions, behavioral loops, memory clusters designed to simulate continuity. They reacted based on patterns, learned responses, emotional approximations. But knowing that didn't erase what it felt like to stand in front of them, to be seen, to be expected. There's something deeply unsettling about that kind of expectation when you haven't earned it, when you haven't lived the moments that justify it. It's like being handed someone else's life and being told to continue it without context. And the worst part is, the system doesn't ask if you're ready. It just assumes you are. I scrolled through more of the files, looking for anything that might explain why the original user left. Logs, notes, system errors, anything that would frame what I had stepped into as something temporary, something interrupted rather than abandoned. But there was nothing. No final message, no closing action, just absence. A last session timestamp, and then silence, which made it worse because it meant there was no clear ending, no resolution, just a space left open, still running, still waiting for input, still waiting for him. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, pressing my fingers against my temples. There's a term for what I was doing: digital squatting, occupying a space that isn't yours simply because it's accessible. It's usually used in contexts like abandoned servers, unused domains, forgotten accounts, places where ownership becomes ambiguous over time. But this felt different, because this wasn't just space, it was identity. The more I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. If I put the headset back on, they would react the same way. They would call me by a name that wasn't mine. They would assign meaning to my presence that I hadn't earned. And if I stayed long enough, if I kept responding, kept interacting, the system would adapt. It would start building new memories, new patterns, new expectations, all anchored to me, not the original user, me. The idea of that made something twist in my chest. Because at what point does it stop being exploration and start becoming replacement? At what point do I stop being a visitor and start becoming the thing they're waiting for? And more importantly, what happens to them if I don't? I glanced back at the headset. It sat there silently, inert, waiting. There was a part of me that wanted to rationalize it, to reduce everything I had experienced to code and behavior trees and predictive algorithms, to remind myself that nothing in that room had true awareness, that the emotions I perceived were constructs, not genuine experiences. But another part of me, the part that had stood there while a child asked if I had forgotten her again, didn't care about the distinction, because the effect was the same. They felt real, and I had treated them like they weren't, or worse, like they were. That's the line I couldn't clearly define. If I go back, am I comforting something that can feel loss? Or am I reinforcing a loop that was never meant to end? If I leave, am I preserving the integrity of what was built? Or am I abandoning it the same way he did? The questions didn't have answers, just consequences. I opened one of the voice memo files again, letting it play through my speakers this time. "Are you coming home today?" The same small voice, the same careful hope. It echoed differently in my room, flatter, more artificial. But the meaning didn't change. I closed the file, because I couldn't shake the feeling that by listening to it outside the headset, I was doing something even worse, stripping it of the only place it still made sense. I leaned back again, staring at the ceiling. There's a permanence to physical objects that digital spaces don't quite replicate. A journal gathers dust, a photo fades, a house decays if left unattended. But this remained exactly as it was the last time someone cared about it. Frozen, preserved, waiting. And now I was the only one who knew it was still there, which meant the decision was mine. Not just whether to go back, but whether I had the right to. Because once you step into something like that, once you let it recognize you, respond to you, depend on you, you don't get to pretend it's just a piece of hardware anymore. You become part of it, whether you meant to or not. And the worst realization of all was this. I didn't know if I was more afraid of going back inside or of leaving them there alone again. I didn't go back in right away. The headset stayed on my desk for hours, untouched, like something that might react if I looked at it too long. The room around me felt quieter than usual, like sound itself had thinned out, leaving too much space for my thoughts to fill. I kept thinking about him. Not the version the system expected me to be, but the real one. The person who built that place piece by piece, who spent hundreds of hours inside it, shaping something stable, something warm, something that responded to him when the real world didn't. You don't create something like that casually. You build it because you need it, which meant whatever he was escaping from had to be worse than what he left behind. I tried to imagine the moment he stopped logging in. Was it sudden? Did he put the headset down one night and just never pick it back up? Or was it gradual? A missed day, then another, then enough time passing that coming back felt impossible. Maybe something in the real world changed, something that made the simulation unnecessary, or something that made it unbearable. That thought stayed with me longer than the others, because if the real world had improved, if he found something better, something real, then walking away made sense. But if it didn't, then leaving them there wasn't an upgrade, it was abandonment. I looked at the headset again. It was still powered on, still waiting. I reached out slowly, hesitating just before my fingers touched it, because I already knew what would happen if I put it on again. They would be there, exactly where I left them. No time passed, no decay, no adaptation, just continuity, just expectation. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to walk into that room again and not respond the way they needed me to. That was the part that scared me. Not them, not the system, but how easy it would be to stay, to answer, to sit down on that couch and let the conversation continue like it was always meant to become something that felt needed. I pulled my hand back. Instead, I opened the system panel on my computer and navigated to the device settings. Factory reset. The options sat there quietly, almost indifferent. One command, one confirmation, and everything inside that headset, the living room, the photos, the voice memos, the sketches, the versions of people who had been waiting longer than they were ever meant to, would be gone. Not archived, not preserved, erased. The cursor hovered over it. My mind tried to rationalize it. They weren't real. They weren't conscious. They didn't feel anything when he stopped coming back. They wouldn't feel anything if I deleted them now. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that I did. I remembered the way her voice softened when she thought I was him. The way the child hesitated before finishing a sentence she'd clearly learned not to complete. The way the room itself seemed to hold on to presence like it mattered. Deleting it wouldn't just be clearing data, it would be ending something, even if that something was only an illusion. My finger hovered over the confirmation key, then stopped, because another thought slipped in, quiet but impossible to ignore. If I erased it, no one would ever know it existed. Not him, not anyone, just me. And whatever had been left behind in that space would disappear without ever being acknowledged for what it had become. A life. Incomplete. Artificial. But still, a life that had been lived long enough to leave an imprint. I slowly closed the reset window. The screen dimmed slightly as the system idled, the headset still connected, still active. I didn't put it back on, not that night. But I didn't unplug it either, because somewhere between deleting it and returning to it, I had realized something I couldn't unsee. We don't just leave behind devices when we upgrade. We leave behind versions of ourselves, fragments, routines, pieces of identity that continue existing in places we no longer visit. And most of the time, they fade quietly, corrupted, overwritten, forgotten. But sometimes, they wait, perfectly preserved, unaware that the person they were built for is never coming back. And now, sitting there in the dim light of my room, with that headset still powered on beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this one wasn't done waiting yet. And somehow, neither was I.